My name is Juniper Oaks, and I am 31 years old. I keep a small cedar box on the top shelf of my closet, behind winter sweaters I never wear anymore. Inside it there is a folded piece of paper, a bus ticket stub, and a photograph of a man I did not know existed until I was 22 years old. I take the box down sometimes on quiet evenings when the apartment feels too still, not out of sadness. More the way you touch a scar you have stopped being ashamed of. The morning it all happened, there was frost on the inside of my bedroom window. That is the detail I always come back to first. Not what was said. Not the sound of my mother's voice. Not the weight of the backpack I had been told to pack the night before. Just that thin film of ice on the glass, catching the early light from the street lamp outside, and me pressing my fingertip against it until the cold burned. It was February. The kind of February that Ontario does without apology, where the sky sits low and gray for weeks. And the sidewalks are buried under that particular shade of dirty brown slush that nobody ever photographs. I had turned 22 3 days before. My birthday had come and gone like most of my birthdays did in that house. Acknowledged briefly, not really celebrated. My mother had set a cupcake on the kitchen table with a candle already blown out. My stepfather had nodded at me from the couch. That was the extent of it. I had learned not to want more than that. What I did not know, going to sleep that February night, was that I would wake up the next morning to my mother standing in my doorway telling me to pack a bag. Not much. Just a few things, she said. Enough for a couple of days. I remember sitting up in bed and watching her face trying to arrange itself into something that was not what it actually was, and failing. She could not look at me directly. She kept glancing toward the hallway, toward the sound of my stepfather moving around in the kitchen. I packed without asking questions. I had a whole childhood of practice at that. It was still dark when we got in the car. My stepfather drove. My mother sat beside him with her coat buttoned all the way up even though the heat was on, and I sat in the back with my bag across my knees and watched the Tim Hortons and the gas stations slide past the window on the highway heading east out of the city. I kept waiting for one of them to say something, to tell me what was happening, to offer me the smallest piece of what was clearly already decided. Nobody said anything. We pulled into the Greyhound terminal in Kingston about 2 hours later. My stepfather put the car in park and left the engine running. My mother turned around in her seat and handed me an envelope. Her hands were not shaking. That is the part that took me the longest to process afterward. Her hands were completely still. Inside the envelope was a one-way bus ticket. The destination was a small town in New Brunswick I had never heard of called Hartwell Crossing. There was also $200 in cash, folded once. I looked up at her. She said very quietly that there were things she could not explain right now, and that this was the best she could do. My stepfather stared straight ahead through the windshield. He did not say a single word, not one. I picked up my bag. I got out of the car. I stood on that sidewalk in the February cold in front of the Kingston bus terminal, and I watched my mother's side of the car as they pulled out of the parking lot. She did not look back. The car turned onto the street and was gone. And I was alone in front of a building I had never been inside with a bus ticket in my hand, and no explanation for any of it. I went inside because the cold was brutal, and because I had nowhere else to go. I sat in the plastic chair nearest the door and I held that envelope, and I did not cry right away. That came later, in the bus bathroom somewhere past Trenton, where I ran the tap to cover the sound and gripped the edge of the sink until my knuckles ached. The ugly kind of crying, the kind that shakes your whole ribcage loose. I cried until there was nothing left, and then I washed my face with paper towels and walked back to my seat and stared out the window at the dark highway for the rest of the night. The bus made stops I barely registered. Belleville, Trenton, Brighton. I slept in pieces, waking up each time the brakes hissed, and each time I woke up there was that half-second of blankness before everything came back. The cupcake with the unlit candle. The envelope. My mother's still hands. We crossed into New Brunswick by early afternoon the next day. The landscape changed in a way that I noticed even through the fog I was moving in. Less flat, more folded, the trees different somehow, older looking, the highway cutting through rock faces that rose steep on both sides. I pressed my forehead against the cold window and watched it go by. Hartwell Crossing was not on any of the highway signs until we were almost there. It was small. The kind of small where the bus stop is not a terminal at all, but a cleared patch of gravel beside a hardware store, and the driver calls out the name and only one person stands up. That person was me. I stepped down off the bus into wind that smelled like wood smoke and pine, and something cold underneath both of those things, and I stood there with my bag and watched the bus pull away. And then I saw her. She was standing near the hardware store entrance, an older woman, I would have guessed in her early 60s, wearing a red wool coat and practical boots, holding a piece of cardboard with my name written on it in black marker. Juniper, just that. Nothing else. I stopped walking. She had the kind of face that has spent real time outdoors, not weathered in a hard way, but present in a way that city faces often are not. When she saw me stop, she lowered the sign slightly and looked at me with an expression I did not have a name for yet. Something between relief and grief, and something else I could not read. She said my name once, as a question, and when I nodded, she exhaled slowly and said, "Your grandmother has been trying to find you for 11 years. I did not know I had a grandmother. I did not know there was anyone looking. Her name was Philippa, and she had been my grandmother's neighbor and closest friend for going on 35 years. She had the kind of calm that comes from having been through enough difficult things that she no longer felt the need to paper over them with nervous chatter. She took my bag without asking and put it in the back of her truck. A practical dark green pickup with mud along the wheel wells, and she said the drive was about 20 minutes and that my grandmother would explain everything herself when we got there, because that explanation belonged to her to give. I sat in the passenger seat and watched New Brunswick pass by the window. It was beautiful in a severe way, and I kept getting caught off guard by it. The river that ran alongside the road for a stretch, still half frozen at the edges. The older farmhouses set back from the road, their woodpiles stacked high and neat. The stands of spruce pressing close on either side. There was something about the scale of it that made my particular situation feel both very small and very significant at the same time, which I could not explain then and still cannot fully explain now. Philippa turned off the main road onto a narrow lane, and the truck bumped slowly along a gravel track between trees that were so old and large they formed something close to a tunnel overhead. At the end of it was a house. It was not grand. It was the kind of house that had been lived in for a long time by someone who cared about it. A white clapboard farmhouse, with a covered porch along the front, and a stack of firewood under a tarp to one side, and a bird feeder hanging from the corner post that had been recently filled, the seeds bright against the gray afternoon. There were curtains in the windows. Someone had shoveled the front path carefully. Standing on the porch, in a winter coat that was too big for her now, leaning slightly on the porch railing, but not in a way that suggested weakness. More that she was steadying herself against something, the way you do when you have been waiting a very long time for a particular moment, was an old woman. She was watching the truck come down the lane. When I got out, she looked at my face for a long moment, and then she pressed her lips together tightly, and I could see her composing herself with real effort, the way a person does when they are determined not to dissolve. She said my name. The way she said it was different from the way anyone had ever said my name before in my life. Not like a greeting. More like she was confirming something to herself. Like she was checking off a fact she had waited a very long time to verify in person. Her name was Cecelia Oakes, and she was my father's mother. I had not known my father's name. I had not known anything about him at all. Not whether he was alive or dead, not where he had come from, not anything. My mother had for 22 years given me only one sentence whenever I asked, which was that he was gone and it did not matter. I had stopped asking sometime around the age of 12, because that sentence, repeated enough times, eventually just becomes the texture of your life. We went inside. Philippa made tea and moved quietly around the kitchen in a way that told me she had been in that house many times over many years. And my grandmother sat across from me at a kitchen table covered with a faded floral cloth and a small clay pot of dried lavender, and she looked at me steadily and said that she had not had enough time in her life to prepare for this moment correctly. So she was just going to tell me everything she knew, and I could ask whatever I wanted. She began at the beginning. My mother had come to Hartwell Crossing the summer she was 23, following a boyfriend who had since become irrelevant to this story. She had met my father at a community event, a small summer fair out by the fairgrounds on the edge of town. He was 25, worked as a licensed electrician, had grown up 2 concessions over from this very house. His name was Griffin. Griffin Oakes. My grandmother's voice did not waver when she said his name, but I watched her hands tighten slightly around her mug. She said my mother and my father had loved each other in the way young people love each other when they are both a little lost and have not yet learned how to be careful with that feeling. Earnestly, and not always wisely, and with a great deal of hope. She had liked my mother. She wanted me to know that. She had thought she was a smart and warm woman who had made a choice that my grandmother still did not entirely understand, but had, over the years, tried to make peace with. When my mother got pregnant, things had been fine between them. Good, even. There had been talk of them finding a place together, staying in the area, building something. And then my mother's family had arrived, specifically her parents, who were people from a different kind of world, professional, city-based, with opinions that arrived like weather fronts. They had not thought much of Hartwell Crossing or of Griffin or of any of it. And there had been a man in Toronto, a colleague of my grandfather's, who had expressed interest in my mother, and who had, by the time I was born, made it very clear that his interest was serious and came with a kind of stability that a young electrician in rural New Brunswick could not offer. She said this without bitterness. She just laid it out like a document she had been reading for years, and had memorized without meaning to. My mother had left when I was 6 weeks old. She had gone back to Toronto. She had not told my father directly. She had sent a letter, which had arrived after she was already gone, and which my grandmother had watched him read at this same kitchen table on a morning in October, when the maples were red, and the light came in through that window just there at a certain angle that made everything look more significant than it was. He had folded the letter up and put it in his pocket and gone outside, and she had not seen him cry about it, not once, though she had heard him sometimes through the wall of the house in the weeks after, when he did not know she was nearby. Griffin had tried to maintain contact. He had written letters to an address my mother had given him that, it turned out, had been her parents' address, not hers, and her mother had apparently intercepted them. He had called a number that was disconnected within a few months. He had, eventually, through a friend of a friend, found out that my mother had married, and that I had been given the new husband's surname, and that this was, as far as the people around my mother were concerned, the end of any prior story. My grandmother had never accepted that. This was the part where I had to put my mug down because my hands had started to be unreliable. She had written letters of her own over the years. To lawyers. To a family mediator in Fredericton who had told her, gently but plainly, that without court involvement, there was very little she could do before I was an adult. She had put money aside, a small amount each year from her pension, into an account she had labeled in her record simply as J, for a day she was not sure would ever come. She had marked every February 10th in her calendar for 22 years. She had saved every Christmas card she had made for me that she had no address to send to, in a shoebox on the top shelf of the closet in what had been Griffin's old room, which she had not changed. When I turned 18, she had hired a woman in Moncton who did private research to try to locate me. That process had taken 4 years. When she had finally found my mother's current address and name, she had reached out through a lawyer with a simple formal letter explaining who she was and asking only that I be told she existed. The response, which had come not from my mother but through my stepfather's family's legal contact, had been $300 deposited into the lawyer's account, and a bus ticket sent anonymously to a name they assumed was still the one I used, along with the Hartwell Crossing address. My grandmother had found out about the ticket from Philippa, who had a cousin in Kingston who had overheard something. The details were unclear, but what mattered was that Philippa had been standing in front of that hardware store with a piece of cardboard that afternoon, and I had stepped off that bus. I asked her about my father. She was quiet for a moment. Then she told me. Griffin Oakes had died in a workplace accident 11 years ago. He had been 36. He had never remarried, never had other children, had spent his life here in and around Hartwell Crossing, working, building a small addition onto the family property, teaching himself woodworking in his garage on evenings and weekends. He had kept a folder on his desk at home for years that his mother had found afterward, photographs he had printed from social media, things she had posted publicly over the years, school events she had appeared in the background of, local news stories, evidence of a life he was watching from a distance the only way he could. She got up from the table and came back with a wooden box about the size of a shoebox but made from maple. She said he had made it himself. Inside were the photographs and the letters he had written but never sent, because he had eventually stopped trying to send them and had written them anyway, because some things you write for yourself and not for the person you are addressing. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a cloth, was a small carved bird, a cedar waxwing. She said he had made it the February before he died and had carved my name into the base of it in small, careful letters. Juniper. I sat at that kitchen table in Hartwell Crossing for a long time after that. The afternoon light moved across the floor in the particular slow way it does in winter, that pale gold that feels like it is always about to leave. Philippa had quietly gotten up and come back with a plate of oatcakes and said nothing, just set them down and taken her chair again. My grandmother held her mug with both hands and let me have whatever silence I needed, which was more than I could have asked for. I stayed in Hartwell Crossing for 3 weeks. I slept in the room that had been my father's, that still had his hockey equipment in the closet, and a shelf of paperbacks with cracked spines and a window that looked out over the back field toward the tree line. The bed had a quilt on it. My grandmother had made the winter before. She told me, when she had begun to actually believe that one day she might need the room to be ready, not in a superstitious way, just in the way of a person who needs something to do with hope when she has nowhere to put it. It was the first bedroom in my life that had been made ready for me by someone who meant it. I learned things about my father slowly, in pieces, the way you can only really absorb that kind of information. From my grandmother, from Philippa, from 2 of his friends who came by one afternoon. Men in their 40s now, careful and kind with me in the way men are, when they are trying to be adequate to an emotional situation and know they might not be. I learned that he had been funny, quietly, the kind of humor that snuck up on you. That he had been reliable in the particular way of someone who had decided early what kind of person he was going to be. That he had coached minor hockey for a few years. That he had made furniture in the garage and given most of it away. That he had been well liked in a way that was not complicated, which is rarer than people think. I learned what he had looked like. Philippa had photographs on her phone that she had transferred from old prints. He was tall, dark-haired, and he had my jaw. I had never in my life looked at another person's face and found my own jaw. It is a strange and specific thing to experience at 22, and I am not sure I can describe it adequately except to say that it rearranged something in me permanently. I did not go back to my mother's house. Not immediately, and eventually not at all, not in the sense of going home to that place, to those people who had raised me and then handed me a bus ticket on a February morning and driven away. I went back to Toronto eventually. I got my things. I arranged a sublet with a friend. I did it all in a day, while my stepfather was at work and my mother sat at the kitchen table and watched me pack with an expression I still do not know what to do with. Not defiant, not apologetic, something that lived in between those things, something that looked almost like relief, which was the hardest part. I did not say much to her, she did not say much to me. I thought about that later, many times. About what kind of weight you must be carrying when handing your child a bus ticket out of your life looks like the only way you can think of to set something right. I did not forgive her quickly. I want to be honest about that, because the tidy version of this story, the one where realization arrives in a single conversation and resolution follows neatly, is not what happened. What happened was years of working it out slowly, with a therapist I found through my university student services when I went back to finish my degree the following fall, and with a lot of long phone calls to my grandmother on Sunday evenings, and with the gradual, uneven, non-linear process of deciding who I actually was when I was not organizing myself around a loss I had never been allowed to name. What I can tell you is that I am 31 now, and I have a life that feels like mine. I have a relationship with my grandmother that I protect like it is something fragile, because she is 81, and her health is good, but nothing is guaranteed, and I spent 22 years not knowing she existed. I drive out to Hartwell Crossing 4 or 5 times a year. Philippa feeds me oatcakes and strong tea and updates me on everyone in the town in a way that makes me feel I am slowly learning the geography of a place I should have grown up knowing. I go to the cemetery. I stand at my father's grave, and I talk to him, which I was embarrassed about at first and am no longer. I bring him things sometimes. Nothing significant. A small branch of cedar in the fall. A photograph of the view from my apartment that I thought he might have liked. I have the cedar waxwing on my desk. I look at it most days without really registering it, the way you stop seeing things that have become part of the texture of your ordinary life, and then sometimes I look at it and I see it clearly, and I think about a man in a garage on a February evening, carving a small bird and pressing my name into the base of it, for me, without knowing if I would ever hold it. I did not get to choose my beginning. Very few of us do. But I am the one who drove east to Hartwell Crossing when the alternative was staying in a life that had no room for the full version of me. I am the one who walked into that farmhouse kitchen and sat down and let an 81-year-old woman with careful hands tell me the whole truth without cushioning it. I am the one who chose, and keeps choosing, to tend the things that are worth tending. The bus ticket stub is still in the cedar box, on the top shelf, behind the winter sweaters. I keep it there because I have decided it belongs to me now, not as a wound, but as the moment when a door I did not know existed finally opened, and I was just frightened enough and just brave enough to walk through it.